He was the heir to a $400 million empire. He had the finest tutors, the best schools, the most feared last name in the city, but he was failing third-grade math. The problem wasn't his brain. It was the one secret his father couldn't buy, and the one truth the black janitor had been cleaning up for 15 years. Welcome to my channel. Do sit back and enjoy. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more interesting Mafia boss stories. Let's get started. The silence in the marble hallway of St. Jude's Academy was always profound, broken only by the expensive click of leather shoes. But today, the silence was laced with a delicious, nervous tension. Alessio Cassano, the heir to the most discreetly powerful family in the state, strode through the crowd, radiating the arrogant energy that only limitless wealth could buy. He wore a cashmere sweater that cost more than the average teacher's monthly salary, but the expense hid nothing. His world began to tilt when Mr. Davies, the history teacher, intercepted him just outside the main gymnasium. Davies, usually a stiff man of nervous energy, looked genuinely ill. He pressed a folded, white grade slip into Alessio's hand and practically bolted. Alessio, leaning against the cold stone pillar, opened it with the usual expectation, a low C, perhaps, or a mercy pass signed by a desperate administrator. The grade, however, was not merciful. Scrawled in angry red ink at the top of the page was 18 out of 100. Below it, Mr. Davies had scribbled one final, frantic question: "Did you even read the chapter?" Alessio stared at the number, blinked, and a dry, sharp laugh escaped his lips. It was so offensively low, so statistically impossible for a student with his resources, that it became its own kind of power. He folded the paper, tucking the shame into his expensive jacket. He didn't care. He could buy this school, he thought, a familiar defense mechanism clicking into place. But the laughter wasn't over. As he walked toward the parking lot, he saw two lieutenants, stiff, silent men assigned to his protection detail, leaning against the black sedan. They usually maintained the disciplined, unreadable expressions of statues. Today, their eyes flicked to each other, and a small, quick, almost imperceptible smirk crossed the face of the senior guard. It was gone instantly, but Alessio caught it. He realized they weren't paid to protect his body, they were paid to assess his value. And his value had just tanked. The real disaster, however, was already taking root online. A student who had been standing nearby had snapped a picture of the grade slip when Davies handed it over. By lunch, the picture, titled "The Cassano Legacy, 18%, was circulating among the student body, quickly jumping to local gossip blogs. The public, humiliating academic failure was exactly the kind of weakness the family was structured to conceal. At the side entrance, where the delivery trucks and maintenance carts hummed, Elara, the janitor, was working. She was an older black woman, upright and quiet, her uniform clean but worn. She was running a buffer over the polished floor, a faint scent of lemon cleaner filling the air. Alessio didn't see her. To him, she was part of the building's infrastructure. Background noise. But as he stormed past, she paused the buffer, the droning hum dying to a sudden silence. She never looked directly at him, but her eyes, resting on a point just past his shoulder, were quiet and alert. She had seen the flicker of shame in his eyes, the forced arrogance, and the digital humiliation spreading across the student faces. She was the only one who didn't snicker, yet she saw everything. He thought the laughter was aimed at his stupidity. He had no idea it was aimed at his destiny. The news of the 18 over 100-foot grade traveled faster than any wire transfer in the Cassano organization, arriving at Don Cassano's desk before Alessio even reached the mansion's imposing gates. The Don was not a man given to theatrics, but the atmosphere in his private study that evening was heavy enough to choke on. The room was dark walnut and leather, designed for cold, calculated decision-making. Alessio stood before his father's desk, the remnants of his arrogance evaporated by the sheer presence of the man. Don Cassano held the printed-out image of the grade slip, the red ink stark against the polished wood of his desk. He didn't raise his voice. His controlled silence was far more terrifying than any shouting. "A joke, the Don finally said, his voice low and even, a dangerous rumble. The papers are calling you the heir of zeros. You think I care about history, Alessio? I write history. I care about control. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. This empire is built on the illusion of impeccable competence. We are better, smarter, cleaner than the fools in power. Your public, persistent failure, a mockery of the educational system we pay millions to access, shines a spotlight on us. It suggests chaos. It suggests weakness. Alessio stammered, I don't know why, father. I study. The words they don't stick. The words do not stick, the Don repeated, a dangerous smile playing on his lips. You cannot master a high school textbook, yet you expect to master the laws of finance, logistics, and extortion? The government watches the stupid ones. The rivals hunt the weak ones. Your failure is not academic, son. Your failure is a liability. The threat that followed was not financial, it was existential. We have 2 more exams this semester. If you fail to deliver a passing grade, and I mean a discreetly average, invisible grade, I will cease to recognize you. I will remove your name from every ledger, every trust, every safe haven we have built. Your protection detail will be reassigned. Alessio's eyes widened. But, the Ricci family in Jersey. The Riccis are a natural consequence of weakness, the Don cut in, his voice hardening like stone. I will tell them you are an apprentice, a problem I am dumping, without a name or a legacy. You will be learning on the docks, without a single shield. You will be the nameless boy of 18%, learning lessons from men who despise the Cassano name and will take pleasure in your pain. He paused, letting the full weight of the threat settle. You will be exposed, Alessio. And you will not survive the semester. Pass your finals, and make us invisible again, or you will be learning to survive without us. The door to the study opened and closed swiftly as Alessio retreated, leaving his father alone in the cold silence. He stumbled down the grand staircase, the fear a cold knot in his stomach. His father wasn't threatening his allowance, he was signing his death warrant. Failing a test was a joke. Failing the family was a bullet. The weight of his father's threat settled over Alessio like concrete. He retreated to the isolation of his colossal bedroom, the velvet drapes and gilded furniture offering no comfort. He wasn't just facing exams, he was facing exile to a rival family, a slow, guaranteed demise. He dragged out his heavy textbooks, the volumes of European history, advanced calculus, and classical literature that had cost his father a fortune. He didn't just study, he plunged into the texts with a manic, desperate energy, trying to force the information in. But the mental block was real. He would read a page of the English required reading, only to realize he hadn't absorbed a single concept. He stared at complex math equations, his mind looping back to the image of the Ricci docks, the cold, unforgiving water. The fear, a suffocating presence, sabotaged his focus every time. He'd slam the book shut, run his hands through his hair, and the cycle of futile effort and crushing anxiety would begin again. He was hitting a wall not of intelligence, but of pure, paralyzing dread. Late that night, after the house had gone silent, Elara entered his room. She moved like a shadow, efficient and entirely without sound, her presence easily forgotten by the guards and the boss alike. Alessio was asleep, slumped over his massive mahogany desk, his body exhausted by the sheer force of his panic. His textbooks lay open, but the pages were clean of any notes or highlights, a map of his mental shutdown. Elara paused, her gaze settling on the rigid tension in the boy's shoulders. She didn't touch him. Instead, she began her task, not of cleaning, but of quiet, coded intervention. She meticulously cleared away the chaos he'd left behind, but she didn't replace the expensive, new books. Instead, from her apron pocket, she produced a simple, leather-bound book, its spine cracked and worn with use, a cheap, old dictionary. She placed the book precisely in the center of the clean space on his desk. Then, with a practiced, steady hand, she opened it to a specific page. She didn't mark it with a pen, but used the tip of her fingernail to make a nearly invisible, tiny crease on the upper right corner of that page. The word on the page was schema. Beside the book, she placed a freshly cleaned glass of water, positioning it exactly opposite the creased corner, creating a deliberate visual balance on the surface. It was a silent, geometric gesture of order. She lingered for a moment, her quiet eyes full of a mixture of pity and steel. She was planting a seed of knowledge where his father had planted a seed of fear. Then, without a sound, she slipped back into the hallway, leaving the faint scent of lemon cleaner, and the promise of coded help, behind. He woke abruptly, the dictionary and the glass of water the first things he saw. They were too deliberately placed to be accidental. He frowned, wondering if his father had assigned some new, twisted test. He picked up the dictionary, feeling the worn leather under his fingers. He opened it to the creased page. He didn't understand the word schema right away, but the act of discovery was the first thing that had pulled him away from the fear all week. The only person who saw his effort was the one person who saw his true potential. Alessio kept returning to the dictionary. The simple, deliberate placement of the book in the water felt less like a janitorial routine and more like a specific, focused message. He saw Alara in the hallways, always moving, always invisible, her eyes flat and professional. He wanted to ask her about the book, but the fear of exposing her, or worse, exposing himself as someone desperate enough to seek advice from the help, kept him silent. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the endless, quiet pressure of the mansion, Alessio ducked into the library at St. Jude's, a cavernous space where the weight of old knowledge was intimidating. He pulled out a history book, opened it randomly, and found himself staring at a name underlined in faded red ink, Evelyn Wallace. The name meant nothing. He looked closer. The underlining was old, deep, done with the care of someone trying to commit the information to memory decades ago. He idly searched the school's digital archive. Most of the early records were scrubbed clean for security, but the student yearbook archives were public. He typed the name, and a blurry, grainy photo from 25 years ago popped up. It was a picture of the graduating class, but the name next to the photo wasn't Evelyn Wallace. Curious, he searched the faculty directory for the same year. There, under former teaching staff, was the entry, Evelyn Wallace, public high school history teacher, 1998 to 2000. A jarring thought struck him. He remembered Alara's face from the hallway. He looked back at the grainy faculty photo. Though much younger, the eyes, calm, sharp, unafraid, were undeniably hers. The library walls seemed to tilt. The janitor, the invisible woman who cleaned up the debris of his failures, had once been a teacher in this very district. But why the drastic fall? The answer came in a sickening rush of understanding, a sudden, fragmented memory that wasn't his own. Flashback, the scent of cheap institutional coffee. Fluorescent lights humming over a worn desk. A younger Evelyn Wallace, dressed professionally, her voice firm and uncompromising, arguing with an unseen administrator. She was pointing at a stack of student files. Evelyn's voice, younger, determined, "He's being extorted. You know those men are tied to the local crime syndicates. We have a moral obligation to protect this boy." The memory sharpens. Two men, not his father's bodyguards, but men clearly connected to the underworld, walk into the frame. They don't touch her, they simply stand, their eyes radiating cold threat. The implication is immediate and brutal: stop talking, or the consequences will be total. Evelyn Wallace, the teacher, had witnessed the terrifying reach of the organized crime the Cassano family represented, attempting to exploit a student. The flashback cuts to black. Alessio understood instantly. The boss, or someone close to him, had forced her out, systematically destroying her career and reputation, then installing her as the maid in the most visible, humiliating position they could think of. She wasn't just silenced, she was kept as a constant, quiet trophy of the boss's power over even the most ethical people. He shut the yearbook, his hands shaking. Alara didn't have a college secret, she had a moral secret tied to the very system he was failing. She had seen the raw, ugly brutality of his world years ago and been crushed by it. And now, she was trapped cleaning up the messes made by the same regime, silently watching its heir crumble. No one realized she had seen the worst of the boss, and still chose to save his son. The discovery of Alara's past as Dr. Evelyn Wallace, the disgraced teacher, did nothing to ease Alessio's academic panic, but it deepened his desperation. He realized the woman who swept the marble floors wasn't an invisible servant, she was a casualty of the very war he was now forced to fight. And she was the only person who understood the true nature of the enemy, the suffocating control of the Cassano regime. The reprieve after the 18/100 grade was short-lived. One cold, crisp morning, Don Cassano called Alessio into his private study. The mood was grim, professional, and final. His father was seated behind his massive desk, not looking at files, but at a calendar marked with thick, red circles. The semester ends in 10 days, Alessio. You have 3 final, cumulative exams, math, English, and world history. I have received the schedule from the school. The Don tapped the desk with a gold pen, the sound sharp and definitive. There will be no more excuses, no more tutors, and no more negotiations. You will pass all 3 exams with a minimum passing score, or you will cease to exist as a Cassano. Alessio swallowed hard, the familiar fear constricting his throat. What do you mean, cease to exist? Don Cassano leaned forward, his eyes burning with an icy intensity that brooked no argument. I do not mean death, Alessio. Death is fast. I mean unmaking. I will have your name legally stripped from every asset, every account, every document. Your identification will be flagged as fraudulent. You will be placed on a flight, one way, to the Ricci territory in the northeast. You will work on their docks, loading and unloading shipments. Unprotected, unpaid, and utterly nameless. The threat was bone deep. The Ricci family were notorious rivals, men who had lost too much to the Cassanos. They wouldn't kill him quickly, they would savor the slow, deliberate torture of the boss's abandoned son. Alessio would be living bait in enemy territory. The docks are dangerous, father. The Riccis. The Riccis are a natural consequence of weakness, the Don cut in, his voice a low, terrifying growl. Your failure exposes me. If you cannot maintain control over your own basic education, you cannot maintain control over a shipping route, a crew, or a life. You will pass, or you will be used as a painful lesson to our rivals, and you will not survive the summer. He stood up, signaling the conversation was over. Start studying for survival, Alessio. Your life depends on those 3 grades. Alessio stumbled out of the study, the walls of his gilded cage suddenly closing in on him. He wasn't just facing failure, he was facing a premeditated, organized plan for his permanent elimination. The exams were not a test of knowledge, they were the executioner's starting pistol. That night, he didn't study for a grade. He studied for survival. He frantically pulled out the old dictionary Alara had left him. He didn't care about the risk anymore. He had to understand the coded lesson. The subtle crease she had left on the page, the word schema, suddenly felt like the only hope left in his dying world. He needed help, not with history facts, but with the fear that had become his true enemy, and the only person who had ever silently fought the boss was waiting in the shadows. The week leading up to the finals was a blur of terror and frantic, unproductive effort. Alessio had spent hours staring at the word schema in the dictionary, trying to decipher Alara's silent code, but the meaning remained stubbornly academic. He wasn't afraid of the information on the pages, he was afraid of the consequences of the information failing him. His mind, trapped in a loop of fear, refused to cooperate. He was running out of time. The specter of the Ricci docks was closer than the date of the math exam. One evening, deep into the night, Alessio gave up on history and slammed open his calculus textbook. He was trying to solve a simple derivative problem, but his hand was shaking so badly he couldn't hold the pen still. He looked at the numbers, and all he saw were the cold, calculating eyes of his father. He let out a low, ragged sound of despair, dropping his head to the desk. He felt utterly and completely alone. A moment later, he heard the faint, familiar whisper of movement. Elara was there, having come in for her final, late-night round of tidying. She didn't approach him. She simply continued her work near the bookshelves, her back to him, but the methodical rhythm of her cleaning was a steady, grounding beat in his chaos. "It's no use," Alessio finally whispered, the words thin and sharp with defeat. "I can't even solve this. It's too late. I'm going to fail." Elara stopped wiping. She slowly turned, and for the first time, she looked at him not as the heir, but as a desperately frightened boy. Her expression was one of profound, restrained grief. "You are not failing the math, Alessio," she said, her voice soft, yet incredibly clear. It was the voice of a teacher, commanding respect in its simplicity. "You are failing your memory." Alessio stared at her. "What are you talking about?" "It's numbers. They have nothing to do with memory." "Everything has to do with memory," Elara countered, taking a single, slow step toward the desk. She didn't touch the books, but pointed to the old dictionary. "The words you don't know aren't in the textbook. They are in your heart. They are tied to the fear that is drowning your logic." She then did something entirely forbidden. She walked to his large mahogany desk, reached into the small, locked central drawer, a drawer everyone in the house, except the Don, knew was forbidden, and pulled out a tiny, silver locket Alessio hadn't seen in years. It had belonged to his mother, who had died when he was a small child. His father had always insisted the locket was lost. Elara opened it. Inside was a tiny, faded picture of his mother, but on the reverse side of the photo, etched into the silver, were 3 tiny, almost imperceptible symbols. They looked like meaningless scratches. "Your mother was not a scholar of the streets, Alessio," Elara murmured, her eyes distant. "She was secretly a lover of logic and math. She was terrified of your father's world. She knew her days were short. She taught me simple memory tricks, mnemonics, to help me with my own studies, and she asked me to teach them to you one day." She pointed to the derivative problem on his page, then to the symbols on the locket. "Those symbols are the key to the sequence. Your mother used them to organize information. The panic you feel when you look at these numbers is your mind rejecting the study method your father forced on you. It's the repression of your deepest, gentlest memory, the memory of your mother." Tears welled in Alessio's eyes. He hadn't just lost his mother, his father had actively suppressed every gentle memory of her, replacing it with the cold logic of the family. He wasn't stupid, he was experiencing a psychological blockage engineered by grief and fear. "What you said," Alessio choked out, holding the locket, "it unlocked a memory that was more powerful than any lesson." Elara looked him directly in the eye, her resolve hardening. "You are not studying for the Dawn, Alessio. You are studying for her. Your success is the one thing your father cannot control." Clutching the locket, Alessio felt a seismic shift inside him. The shame was gone, replaced by a cold, burning clarity. His failure wasn't a flaw, it was a symptom of his father's cruelty. But one piece of the puzzle remained maddeningly out of reach. Why would his father, who had never stepped foot inside the school since his own youth, be so obsessively terrified of Alessio's high school grades? It wasn't just about control, it was personal. "You knew my mother," Alessio whispered, his voice hoarse. "But you were a teacher here, years ago. Why would my father?" Elara met his gaze, her eyes holding the deep, dark truth of 3 decades of silent suffering. She stepped closer, lowering her voice until it was barely a breath, forcing Alessio to lean in, amplifying the weight of her words. "You didn't find my name in those archives by chance, Alessio," she revealed. "You found it because I taught here 25 years ago. I was Mrs. Wallace, the history and English teacher. And I had a student who failed every single course I taught, repeatedly. A student so ashamed of his inability to read and write beyond a basic level that he became terrified of the very institution that exposed him. She paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air. That student's name was Carlo Cassano. Alessio recoiled as if struck. Don Cassano, the ruthless, all-powerful boss who controlled politicians and global markets, was a high school dropout, a man crippled by shame and functional illiteracy. The gold-plated empire was built on a foundation of intellectual fraud. He failed every test, Elara continued, her voice heavy with the memory. He dropped out, not to start a business, but to avoid the crushing exposure of his academic weakness. He knew the world would never respect a mafioso who couldn't write his own contracts. So he built his empire on brute force and fear, hiring the best minds to be his mouthpieces, forcing him into a pathological need for total control over any place, like this school, that threatened to expose the truth. The picture became horrifyingly clear. Alessio's failures weren't judged on their own merit, they were a reflection of his father's deepest, most guarded secret. The Don didn't care about the grade itself, he cared that Alessio's struggles reopened the 25-year-old wound of his own humiliation. He needed Alessio to succeed not for the legacy, but to retroactively cover his own shame. And he hated Alessio for having his mother's gentle spirit, which always prioritized humanity over cold logic, ensuring his academic failure mirrored his father's. "He kept you here, as a reminder?" Alessio asked, his voice shaking with a terrifying mix of sorrow and vindication. "He kept me here," Elara confirmed, looking around the empty study, to ensure the person who knew his greatest weakness, that he couldn't read his own contracts, would never leave his sight. "And when I saw you failing the same way he shamed himself 30 years ago, I knew his paranoia would lead him to destroy you, too." The shame was transferred. The son realized his failure was a reflection, not a flaw. He was failing the same way his father shamed himself 30 years ago, and Elara, the janitor, was the keeper of the boss's ultimate, devastating truth. The final exams arrived 10 days later, not as dreaded dates on a calendar, but as battlegrounds. Armed with Elara's shocking truth and his mother's secret mnemonic codes, Alessio walked into the school halls a completely different person. The fear that had once paralyzed his mind was now channeled into cold, focused determination. He wasn't studying for the Ricci's, he was studying to deliver a truth bomb to his father. He began with the math exam. As he sat, his hands gripped the locket his mother had left, tracing the 3 tiny, etched symbols. He didn't see the numbers on the page, he saw the pattern, the schema Elara had pointed him toward. He used his mother's simple, almost childish codes to unlock the complex logic problems, circumventing the intellectual block his father's cruelty had built. The answers flowed, clear and logical, fueled not by rote memorization, but by deep, personal retrieval. The English exam followed. Instead of struggling with syntax and literary analysis, Alessio focused on the context Elara had taught him, the analysis of motive, control, and unseen power structures. He wrote a brilliant, blistering essay on the themes of tyranny and inherited shame in classical literature, using his own life as the subtext. He wrote with honesty, a powerful, raw emotion his previous efforts had always lacked. The final exam, history, was the most satisfying. He didn't just recite dates and names, he dissected the material, applying the ruthless, critical perspective he had learned from Elara, the ability to see the why behind the power, the insecurity behind the aggression. He finished the test early, standing quietly amidst the scratching pens, feeling a profound, peaceful sense of completion. He had conquered not the curriculum, but the curse. The report card was delivered to the Cassano mansion 3 days before graduation. Don Cassano demanded it be brought directly to his office. He was flanked by his consigliera, anticipating a meager passing grade that would merely stave off disaster. Alessio walked into the study, calm, his spine straight. The school counselor, trembling, laid the official, sealed envelope on the desk. The Don tore it open with a razor-like efficiency. His eyes scanned the scores: math, 92%. English, 95%. History, 90%. Not merely passes, but honors. Unblemished academic triumph. A wave of success should have hit the room. Instead, a profound silence descended, heavier and more dangerous than any failure. Don Cassano's face did not register pride, it registered pure, unadulterated terror. He slammed the report card onto the desk, rattling the antique inkwell. "This is impossible," he hissed, his voice trembling for the first time in Alessio's memory. "You couldn't pass a basic quiz a month ago. Who did this? Who coached you?" Alessio met his father's eyes without flinching. "I learned how to study, father. I learned how to see the patterns you didn't want me to see. I learned from the person you thought was nothing." The Don's gaze instantly fixed on the door, then darted to the consigliera, a desperate plea for denial. But the secret was out. He knew precisely who had done it. Ilera. The woman he humiliated daily, the walking, breathing symbol of his academic and intellectual shame, had succeeded in educating his son where his millions and his threats had failed. She had taught Alessio how to read, how to think, and how to conquer the very shame that had crippled him. The rage was instantaneous and total. It wasn't the rage of a disappointed father, but the blind panic of an exposed fraud. The boy passed. The father failed to hide his lifelong secret. The explosion of Don Cassano's rage was terrible and brief, contained within the confines of his study. He screamed, not about the high grades, but about the source. He screamed Ilera's name, swearing vengeance, demanding she be found and silenced immediately. But Alessio, having won his life back, was untouchable by simple threats. He walked out of the study, leaving his father choking on his own shame and the bitter triumph of the janitor. The next day, Ilera was gone. Fired instantly, escorted off the property before sunrise, with no chance for a farewell. The mansion felt emptier and colder without her quiet, constant presence, but her lessons remained. The culmination of the academic year arrived with the senior graduation ceremony. It was a high-profile, televised event that his father, despite his rage, was compelled to attend, a public display of the Cassano legacy. Don Cassano sat in the front row, rigid and pale, his eyes scanning the auditorium, half expecting Ilera to appear, half fearing the public exposure that felt inevitable. Alessio was the surprise choice for the senior address, a last-minute replacement engineered by the school to celebrate his impossible academic turnaround. He walked onto the stage, not in the expensive designer suit his father had purchased, but in a simple, dark ensemble, carrying only a folded piece of paper, his speech. He looked across the sea of expectant faces, meeting his father's burning, paranoid gaze, and began to speak. "For most of my life, I believed winning meant control. Control over people, control over resources, control over the narrative. I had the finest education money could buy, yet I failed every test. I failed because I was afraid. I was afraid of disappointing the man who defined success as absolute, ruthless control." The audience shifted, uneasy at the unexpected honesty. Alessio paused, then let the power of the truth ring through the microphone. But true failure isn't a low grade. True failure is when you allow shame to build a cage for your mind. I learned this from someone who saw potential where everyone else saw only failure, someone who taught me that the truth is the only real weapon. He didn't name Ilera. He didn't have to. "She was not my tutor," Alessio continued, his voice rising with clear, profound conviction. "She had no office, no title, no authority. She was a teacher who had been unjustly silenced, reduced to scrubbing the floors of this school. Yet, she had more integrity, more wisdom, than the entire establishment put together." His father's face was stone, but his hands, visible to Alessio, were clenching the armrests until his knuckles were white. Alessio concluded his speech, not with a standard thank you, but with a quote he had written down in his notebook, a piece of literary analysis that Ilera had made him study intensely during their clandestine lessons. He delivered it with piercing clarity, looking directly at the front row. As one writer said, the greatest deception men suffer is from their own opinions. But I would add this, the greatest tyranny is believing that the words you never learned to read can never be used to judge you. Then, for the absolute final, devastating confirmation, Alessio delivered the coded phrase, a short, precise summation Alera, his former history teacher, had used years ago to simplify a complex concept about the fall of Rome, a phrase she had once used to shame her illiterate student, Carlo Cassano. "Thank you," Alessio finished, his voice final and strong. "And remember this, legacy dies not with the sword, but with the failure to learn the first lesson." The reference was obscure to the audience, but to Don Cassano, it was a precise, devastating recall of his deepest, darkest failure, spoken by his own heir on a public stage. The Don was exposed, not as a killer, but as a terrified, illiterate fraud whose empire was built on a lie. His entire public persona, his legitimacy, his control, all hinged on the power of the written word he could not master. The applause was thunderous. The boss sat motionless, defeated. He had spent decades believing he could erase the truth with money, only to have his shame taught back to him by the son he had tried to destroy. The Mafia boss realized the real failure was believing that you could erase the truth with money.